but we are not started yet. No, we're not live yet, correct? Laura or staff? I don't want to be live quite yet.
We are live, yes.
We are live. Okay. Well, welcome back. Let's see. We don't have all of the members of the CEPAC. There we go. I think we're almost rounding out. We need just a couple more people back. I see George, Rena, I hope, who had computer problems earlier. I hope those have been sorted. Just going to wait one more minute because it's not quite 12:45 yet. But everybody else is ready. Thank you so much. So let's just wait for one more CEPAC member. All right, Laura, can you try to separately contact Rena and see if she can rejoin?
Yes.
All right, thanks. Okay. So that was great discussion. Obviously, a lot of territory covered already, but a lot yet to go. So in the next 1 hour, we are going to have a series of voting questions, first on comparative clinical effectiveness, then on that set of what we call contextual considerations and potential other benefits, before you can kind of call it a conclusion vote or a summary vote on value for money, long-term value for money. So the way this is going to be structured is we're going to show each voting question and then open it back up for deliberation. I'm going to ask the ICER research staff to very briefly summarize again where the evidence comes from. We do have this evidence summary for the members of the CEPAC. It's just the tables from the report. And ask the ICER research staff to very briefly summarize the status of the evidence and the rationale behind some of the ratings and cost effectiveness findings. So let's go ahead and see the first voting question. All right, for all of these questions until otherwise noted, we're talking about the patient population with adults with relapsing forms of multiple sclerosis, including clinically isolated syndrome, relapsing remitting MS, and active secondary progressive MS. Next slide. Okay, we see, good. So the first vote, given the currently available evidence, is the evidence adequate to distinguish the net health benefit provided by ublituximab from that provided by other monoclonal antibodies, natalizumab, ofatumumab, ocrelizumab, and rituximab? Yes or no? Grace, I'll invite you to, again, briefly summarize the evidence, point to where it is in the evidence summary, and describe the ICER evidence ratings.
Thank you. So here I'm going to refer to page 8. In table 3 on page 8, our evidence comes from the network meta-analysis, which included ublituximab and natalizumab, ofatumumab, ocrelizumab, and rituximab. And so you'll see that for the outcomes of ARR, annualized relapse rates, there was no difference between ublituximab with the other monoclonal antibodies. There are some slight point differentials, but all those confidence intervals cross 1, so no significant difference. For the outcomes of confirmed disability progression, I'll remind you that rituximab, we felt like did not have adequate data for us to include in the NMA, so that one does not have a comparison. And again, we see, although there are differentials in the point estimates, that the confidence intervals are quite wide and they all cross 1. So we concluded that there was no significant difference between ublituximab and the other monoclonal antibodies. And that led us to an I rating for all of those comparisons.
Can you comment separately on the harms data?
Yes, the harms data you can find on pages 10 and 11. There's a table there. And there are some slight differing harms. So as a class, I think we heard from our clinical experts that the main issue would be infections. Recurrent infections, but in particular, we wanted to pull out the JCV, risk of JCV infection, risk of PML, excuse me, with JCV infection with natalizumab, which is a black box warning. And then that is also it's a warning on rituximab, although it does not, that is because it's not labeled for MS. It's not a separate, that isn't a label specific to MS. And as we heard from the clinical experts, PML does occur in other, with other DMTs. And in general, in the trials for ublituximab, that had an active comparator. They did have more side effects and discontinuations compared with teriflunomide, and that was the direct evidence. We weren't able to compare ublituximab to the other monoclonals class-wise for harms in terms of an NMA. So all of this is sort of qualitative comparison.
All right, good. Okay, open the floor to questions, comments from the CEPAC. Do you guys have any questions about this question? Okay, I know it's already been discussed. Why don't we go ahead and put the voting question back up and you guys can take your vote. We should have 10 voting members of the CEPAC, so as soon as we see 10, we can show the results. Okay, if anybody's having problems with the voting software, now is a good time to tell us. We're almost at 10 though. There we go. Okay, show the results, please. Okay, 10 no and 0 yes. All right, so let's go forward to the next question. And again, these questions, we could ask a lot of questions of, this versus that, but I think people will recognize that we decided to frame these questions in part to reflect what we were hearing were going to be some of the key decisions being made around coverage, including things like step therapy that we'll talk about later, et cetera. So that's why these questions are generally framed the way they are. So question number 2 is, again, same patient population, given the currently available evidence, is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of ublituximab is superior to that provided by fumarates? And I'll just list them: dimethyl fumarate, diroximel fumarate, and monomethyl fumarate. Grace, to you again.
Yes. So as you see in table 3, if you go down to dimethyl fumarate, you'll see that ublituximab was superior to dimethyl fumarate from our NMA with a rate ratio of 0.57 for the annualized relapse rate. It also appeared to be point estimate wise better than ublituximab was better than dimethyl fumarate for CDP 3 and 6, although again, there's a lot more uncertainty in these estimates and the results weren't statistically significant. And then I'll just remind you that we didn't include diroximel fumarate and monomethyl fumarate because those are thought efficacy-wise to be equivalent to dimethyl fumarate.
Okay, so table 3 has the point estimates in the confidence interval from the NMA, right?
Yes, and then in terms of harms, right, for dimethyl fumarate, the main side effects seem to be gastrointestinal, and people often discontinue because of gastrointestinal side effects. And I think we heard Dr. Langer-Gould mention that that 50% of people are not on dimethyl fumarate, who start dimethyl fumarate on dimethyl fumarate after a year. So there's some pretty significant, I think, GI side effects with the fumarates. Okay,
and is there any head-to-head data? There is with teriflunomide, right?
Just with teriflunomide, but not with the fumarates, no.
Okay. All right, CEPAC, any questions as you think about the net health benefit of ublituximab? Is it, if you will, demonstrably, is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that it's superior to that provided by fumarates? And I'm sorry, Grace, did you get a chance to summarize the evidence rating?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. We gave this evidence rating of C++, which means that it is at worst comparable. Ublituximab is at worst comparable, but could be, incremental or all the way up to superior to the fumarates, that there's just a lot of uncertainty there.
Okay, I'm going to be an imposter for someone on the CEPAC. And I'm going to say, I understand two things: that you can have a point estimate of where you think the net health benefit does or doesn't differ, and a kind of a confidence interval in your head about the uncertainty. So where is the point estimate? If people say, if they ask you based on the evidence, does it suggest, I won't even say demonstrate, but does the point estimate suggest that ublituximab is better than the fumarates? Or what would you say to that question first?
Yeah, I think that is, based on the magnitude, even if, the statistical significance is, there's a lot of factors that go into that, but based on the magnitude of difference, that ublituximab shows, better efficacy than the fumarates. So I would be more on the, and how large that is, though, is I think that's where the uncertainty is. And so I would be more on the, not comparable. It's probably better, but how much better is it is unclear.
And so why did comparable still remain in your conceptual confidence interval, if you will?
I think this is based on the fact that the data on progression, is not that great. Again, that's the less certain. And then also harms, there are greater harms probably in terms of the monoclonal antibodies more than with the fumarates, even though the fumarates have a lot of tolerability problems. Some of the more severe side effects, you can see some more severe side effects with the monoclonal, with ublituximab. So I think that was, if you, depending on how an individual weights those individual benefits and harms, that you could say, that maybe it's the harms outweigh some of the benefits.
All right, thank you. Jason, I see a hand up. If others have questions, please go ahead and raise your hands. I'm going to ask the clinical experts to weigh in a second too. Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate these very helpful explanations. I guess I just would say that I just want to make sure I understand the rationale for the evidence decision. So obviously, I recognize that I'm getting into controversial territory in statistics in terms of non-inferiority margins, but conceptually, it sounds like the confidence interval was influential in the evidence rating. The confidence interval includes the possibility of being worse. So I recognize that I'm in, it's a difficult thing because you have to sort of prove the negative, and there's statistical issues around non-inferiority margins. But that being said, I mean, I understand that the uncertainty led to the C++ as opposed to a stronger confidence, but I mean, how can we exclude that it's actually worse?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that, that was part of our discussion of, I think this goes back to the whole issue of measurement of CDP and how CDP is measured. So that's where uncertainty came in. But if you look at ARR, those confidence intervals are much smaller. They exclude one. And we heard from our clinical experts that preventing relapses is an important part of treatment of MS and important to patients because it has downstream consequences. The other thing I think that is an issue here is for progression. All these randomized trials are 2 years. 2 to 3 years worth of data, and progression, as we've heard from our clinical experts, takes place over a long period of time. So we just probably aren't capturing necessarily what happens 5 or 10 years down the line. We heard that there's some real world evidence that that the outcomes are durable, for that long. But again, I think that may be a limitation of the fact that we're using randomized trial data as well.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Bruce or Annetta, when you see this question and you think about the evidence that's we're asking to be used as the basis for an answer, what's your reaction? Feel free to make a comment. You don't have to say how you would vote in that sense, but how would you advise the CEPAC to think through the evidence as they're making this vote? Annetta, you want to go? Oh, Bruce, go ahead.
That's right. Annetta, go ahead.
Again, when you make these reports, you have to follow rules, and they've done a great job following the rules. But if you take the larger context, I think Grace summed it up very nicely. These trial populations are by no means representative of what we see in the real world. You have to also remember the way they're recruiting these trials. Most sites contribute only one patient. A high recruiting site might be 4. Most of them are coming out of Eastern Europe. Again, and they're including patients that are already sort of at the beginning of transition to secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. And so it's this hodgepodge of like effect on relapse and clinical disability progression. So I would look at it as a larger package, as Grace pointed out, and say, given the sum of the evidence on MRI and relapse rates and what we know about relapse rates and long-term disability, I would not worry so much about that lower bounds of the confidence limits, implying that it could be worse, that ublituximab could be worse, less effective than the fumarates.
Okay, Bruce?
Yeah, so I agree. I'd like to thank Grace, because I think she did a very nice job of summarizing the limitations of this sort of analysis when you look at 2-year trial reports and try to extrapolate to progression over a lifetime. I think the things to remember are that there is clear evidence that ublituximab is superior in terms of relapse suppression. And we know that relapse suppression clearly contributes to subsequent disability progression. So I think even though the short-term data is insufficient to demonstrate that statistically, I think conceptually, that's still something to keep in mind. I think the only way that ublituximab could be inferior to dimethyl fumarate would be at the harms level, and there's no clear evidence that it is. And the main issue with harms that we have from the clinical trials would be the infusion reactions.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions from CEPAC as you think through the evidence here? George?
Just a question for our clinical experts. When you're with your patients and talking about dosing of a monoclonal antibody, and I'll just use rituximab as an example, even though I know we didn't specifically look at rituximab, but thinking about the immunosuppressive effects thereof in the context of a pandemic, right? At least in our field of hematology, we've been a little bit more careful with regards to thinking about now the harms, especially in the context of completely different patient populations where we do worry about infectious risk more so than we used to 3 years ago. So I'm curious, in the multiple sclerosis world, is this something that you talk about with your patients at all? Does that dissuade you maybe from using a monoclonal agent at all, or that doesn't really have an effect on your thinking?
So I'll take that one. Sorry about my dogs. During the pandemic, we actually extended dosing interval on everyone with rituximab to once-a-year infusions. And then we started paying a lot more attention to how many B cells they had back, because there's good evidence that if they have 40 or more B cells in their periphery, they're going to mount a full immune response. I would say that before the advent of vaccines, we were a little, we followed the risk stratified algorithm a little more carefully, and we did start more patients on interferons and dimethyl fumarate. Some of those patients have remained on those treatments and have remained stable. A lot of those patients did not remain stable, and they have now switched over to rituximab. But I think the way rituximab works in MS, you don't really need to give this drug every 6 months in perpetuum, and we know that you don't need continuous B cell depletion to maintain efficacy. And so, we both in CISER, where we've used a lot of this for the last 10 years, and in the country of Sweden, which started using it and has similar experiences, most of our patients after the first 2 years are on annual infusions, and we allow them to repopulate in between. Some of our patients are on every 18 to 24 months, and 95% of them are stable on that regimen, both by MRI and disability and relapse criteria. The 5% where we do see some return of disease activity, we put them back on every 6 months, and they return to being controlled. So it's a little bit different than some other autoimmune diseases where once you release them, you may not be able to get them back with the same drug. Our experience has been that in that small proportion, we can get them back with the same drug.
So
Great, thanks.
we do tell people that observational studies, all of which have varying levels of acquisition bias, have suggested that if somebody does get COVID, that there is some increased risk of more severe disease, but not mortality if they're on a B-cell depleting therapy. On the other hand, because these drugs are relatively selective for B-cell depletion, there are still T-cell responses to immunization, which has been shown. And so although we tell people about this, the more important issue is what is the risk of the MS? And if the risk of the MS is severe disability and a lifetime of compromised quality, I think that overweighs the risk of a slightly more severe disease should they get it. And obviously we have means of addressing that with Paxlovid. So I don't think that it's, although we disclose this and discuss this with patients, I don't think it's affected our use of the drugs. And furthermore, I think that my own personal experience has been that most of my patients who have been on B-cell depleting agents who have got COVID have actually done very well.
Great, thank you. Good question, great answers. Why don't we go ahead and go to the voting question again? So as you remember, is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of ublituximab is superior to that provided by fumarates? A, yes, B, no. I can go ahead and vote. Okay. Got 9 yes and 1 no. All right, why don't we keep going? The next voting question is similarly framed. Same patient population, given the currently available evidence, is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of ublituximab is superior to that provided by fingolimod? Grace, again.
Thanks, Steve. And here we're using fingolimod as kind of the example of the S1P receptor antagonists. And so if you go back to table 3, you'll see that ublituximab was statistically significantly better than fingolimod with a rate ratio of 0.63 for ARR. And then going over to CDP3 and CDP6, again, we see the same pattern of numerically, you see about a 25%, 20 to 25% difference between ublituximab and fingolimod, with ublituximab being better, but again, with the wider confidence intervals for the reasons that we've been discussing. In terms of the harms for fingolimod and the S1P receptor modulators, there is cardiac toxicity that's known, and so there does need to be first dose monitoring, as I think we've mentioned earlier. So that's the main severe side effect with fingolimod.
Okay, great. Let's discuss if there are any questions about this. You may have worked through the paradigm of how you're thinking through this with the previous question, but does anybody have a separate question about the comparison with fingolimod? Okay, great. Let's go ahead and vote. That was quick. All right. I could call out that one person who likes to be the contrarian here, but maybe I'll let them stay confidential, and given that the vote is fairly lopsided. But I will offer the opportunity for the public record if the person would like to say why they feel that the evidence is not adequate. Be happy to hear it, but you don't have to. Okay, let's go to the next set of questions. We've moved from the few comparative clinical effectiveness questions to some broader questions in some way. We'll start with contextual consideration questions and then move to questions about specific potential other benefits or disadvantages of ublituximab. So with the next slide, when making judgments, this is a contextual issue, when making judgments of the overall long-term value for money, which we're going to do shortly, and when we think about broader policymakers doing so, what is the relative priority that should be given to any effective treatment for multiple sclerosis on the basis of the following contextual considerations? Before we go to the next slide, when you read this question, the point is to not focus on ublituximab as a specific treatment and its relative benefits or disadvantages to others. Those questions are coming. This is really trying to capture the context of multiple sclerosis as it exists today. Based on the current treatment options, in a sense, prior to ublituximab, we just want to think about, like, what is the context around the following considerations? And the first one you'll see is, next slide, whether there's an acuity of need for treatment of individual patients based on their short-term risk of death or progression to permanent disability. Barry already commented on this, and I'm going to invite her to comment again if she wishes, for sure. But the idea here is that severity of illness is often talked about as something that we want to take into consideration when considering the value of any new treatment. And severity can be kind of distinguished between the acute need of a patient who might have a very high risk of dying in the short term, for instance, and the magnitude of the lifetime burden is another way to think of severity. So we're going to have two different questions. First on the acuity of the need, and the second, coming shortly, will be on the magnitude of the lifetime burden. So this is kind of partly just a clinical epidemiological consideration around whether people with multiple sclerosis are at, short-term risk of death or progression to permanent disability. Actually, Barry, would you like to comment again on this one at all before we have other comments?
Sure, Steve. I think, we talked about, we don't see risk of immediate death in MS. And in fact, the lifetime of people with MS is shorter by about 7 years. So not a great deal of significance that you may see in some other diseases or conditions, but it is a little bit there. But certainly the goal in treatment is to prevent the accumulation and worsening of disability over time. And that, again, can be physical disability. It can also be cognitive disability. And so we do know the two primary reasons why people prematurely leave the workforce, for example, are fatigue, which we talked about earlier, but the second is cognition. So there's great impact there.
Great. These questions are difficult because they're trying to capture this kind of instinct for prioritizing health in different ways. But I would make another comment, which is voting on this doesn't mean that patients shouldn't be treated right away. It's not like we're suggesting if they don't have short-term death or progression to permanent disability in 6 months that we should wait in any sense of that meaning. So don't interpret this question as suggesting that a no vote means that we can slow down or something like that. Any other questions or comments about this voting question, about the acuity of the need? And then we'll vote on the long time. Yes, Steve.
Thanks. I don't have a real good grip on what percentage of patients who have a relapse end up with a disability that may persist even, once they recover.
Well, it's kind of cumulative, but Annetta, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so that would be the confirmed disability progression rates in the clinical trials are going to be a combination of bad relapses and then patients who have transitioned to SPMS during the trials. And I believe they're around 8 to 10%. Is that right, Grace, at the 2-year mark in the placebo arms? Some of the older trials that was higher, it was like 16%, but in current populations, it's lower. In the all drug comparator, so as long as they're on a treatment, regardless of which one they start out of Sweden, at 3 years, it was around 4%. So
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand conceptually that what we're measuring is the tip of an iceberg. That progression and the biological mechanisms that lead to progression that we can measure by EDSS, which is what's typically used. And even those things begin way before the EDSS changes. And so even though there may be compensatory mechanisms and repair mechanisms that are healthy early on that allow for repair in the context of normalization of the EDSS or recovery of the EDSS, that doesn't mean that there's not an effect from that damage, and that the cumulative effect of that damage over time is what leads to the expression of disability we can measure after thresholds are reached. So that's what underlies the importance of early therapy and the importance of highly effective early therapy on the eventual disability course of an individual patient.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, let's back up the voting question, please. Okay, so again, the contextual consideration, the relative priority based on the acuity of need for the treatment of individual patients based on their short-term risk of death or progression to permanent disability, from very low priority to very high priority. Make sure you get your scaling right as you go ahead and vote, please. All right. Okay, we've got 4 low, 2 average, and 4 high. All right, let's go to the next question. All right, now we're asking about the contextual issue around the magnitude of the lifetime impact on individual patients of the condition being treated. I doubt anyone needs to hear this again, but I feel like we should have, patients comment on it again, perhaps. So let's take the slide down and allow some conversation. This is asking about the magnitude of the burden on people's lives. And burden sometimes isn't the right word, but if you think of health in an entire lifespan and what multiple sclerosis, a life with it, does to that life, we want to talk about the burden, which is the commonly used term, of the condition on people's ability to have a lifetime of full health. Lauren, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, definitely. This is something that I can really speak to as I was diagnosed, as a teenager. I had kind of my whole life ahead of me. I mean, I still do. I'm only 27, but it's really daunting to have that diagnosis at such a young age. I had just started college. I hadn't declared a major yet. And so having that diagnosis kind of did change the trajectory of things. I had been thinking about different majors. I ended up going towards neuroscience because of the obvious relevance. But not only that, being put on an effective medication right away just really changed, I think, the outcome of my disease trajectory and of my life. I had a very severe relapse with a lesion in my spine. I could hardly walk. And I still suffer from some of that now, but I pass as normal every day. And because I was on this medication, I went back to college, to my out-of-state school. I went into research. I met my husband. I pursued my PhD. And I honestly don't know if any of that would have been possible had I not been on this effective therapeutic.
Great, thanks. Anybody else want to add or say anything else on this point before we vote? Okay, let's go ahead.
Steve, can I just say one thing?
Oh, sure, Jason. Yeah.
Lauren, I just wanted to thank you for sharing your story. And I just want to say, I cannot imagine being able to say something that was more helpful and informative to this specific question. Thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing your story. And that was just really so important and helpful.
I'm really happy to. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you. Let's go to the voting question. Magnitude of the lifetime impact on individual patients of MS from very low priority to very high priority. Almost already have 10. There we go. Okay, we have 1 average, 2 high, and 7 very high. All right, thanks. Okay, so that's part of the context. Now, let's go ahead and move to the next slide set. Okay, so now the trick here is we're no longer talking about multiple sclerosis full stop. We're really talking about ublituximab again. So if we think about its added benefits, if any, versus dimethyl fumarate, we want to see if they're are added benefits that somehow fall, if you will, beyond or in addition to what we've talked about in terms of their clinical effects measured by trials. So we have several of these that could be additional benefits, if you will, of ublituximab. So let's look at the first one. There are 3 of them. Okay. The first one is on patients' ability to achieve major life goals related to education, work, or family life. Now, this is, in a sense, kind of double counting because we know that health helps patients do this, but we want to make sure that we capture, in a sense, the longer arc of the way that health benefits that could be provided by a new treatment could add additionally to patients' ability to do these kinds of longitudinal things in their life that might not in some ways be fully captured by the year-to-year health effects. So again, here it's from A major negative to E major positive. Again, the difficulty here is, Lauren, from your comment, it's like having an effective therapy has a huge impact on this, as you just commented. The question here for the panel is to think about whether ublituximab should be given any, if you will, additional kind of thinking about value based on its relative advantages over other available treatments. So, Jean, go ahead.
So, sorry. So I have a question I'm just curious, really, and it's really about the class of drugs, not this specific one or treatments, rather. In other conditions that we've reviewed, having an oral agent seemed to be a lot more preferable to patients in terms of convenience. But I'm sensing in this case, and maybe it's because the infusions are spaced fairly far apart, that's not perceived quite the same way here. This is probably a red herring, but I'm just curious about what does that impact have?
Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's variable per individual, certainly, but I think some of the benefits of an infused treatment that we hear from people are, one, the monoclonal antibodies are in this highly effective class, which is appealing to a lot of people from, of course, from a disease state of where they are when they're diagnosed or when they move on to that treatment, but also from a mental health perspective and knowing they're doing everything they can and attacking MS as aggressively as they can early on. I would say from your question, sort of oral, certainly some people prefer that. Some people also prefer the infusion because they are spaced. Natalizumab is 1 month apart. The others are 6 months apart. The comments from a lot of people is they like to be able to not have to think about MS every day. They may still be dealing with symptoms of it every day, but not having to think about their treatment regimen for MS every day can also help with some of the mental health symptoms and side effects that we see for MS.
Thanks. Actually, I think we should capture, we'll capture that in our final report, even if it's not a specific voting question here, that, as you said, the relative advantage for some patients of having this. It's different than dimethyl fumarate. There are other IV treatments that can be given at in the same cadence, but it's worth noting. I thought Lauren was up first before Annette, but for some reason Annette has popped into the lead here. So Lauren, why don't you go ahead and go first, and then Annette.
Sorry, I think that was my fault. I turned off the raise hand and turned it back on. But I just wanted to echo what Barry said, which is I think it's different for every patient. For me personally, I decided taking an oral medication twice a day, 2 pills a day, was the thing for me. It's been a very effective medication, but I have peers who have failed on Tecfidera who have decided they don't want to adhere to that twice a day pill, or they keep forgetting it because of their cognitive difficulties, et cetera. And having that 6-month or yearly infusion is more convenient for them. It works better for them. So there's definitely individual variation from person to person on what is the most effective and what has the best risk benefit ratio for people.
Great, thanks. Okay, Annette.
Okay, so reiterate that there have been 2 treatment satisfaction surveys both done in the country of Sweden. Patients on rituximab are much happier with their treatment than any other treatment out there. So the pill, some people do prefer pills. It does require continual compliance and continual healthcare coverage, and so that is a problem. The one thing we hear with the rituximab treated patients, as Barry said, is I love this drug. I get to forget that I have MS in between. Especially if you start this drug right at disease onset with their first relapse, most of these patients will never have a relapse again. They'll never have a new lesion in an MRI, and they just need to come in once a year. They don't get rebound relapses. Now, that does not happen with the modestly effective therapies either. So dimethyl fumarate, the injectables, if they stop their disease activity at a young age, the disease activity will typically return, but not with a vengeance. If they stop fingolimod, or one of the S1P1 inhibitors, or natalizumab, there is a high risk in relapsing remitting MS patients that their disease will not just come back, but come back with a vengeance, meaning they have relapses that are worse than ones they've ever had before. And both drugs have been associated with rare but fatal reactivation of disease activity after discontinuation. So I think, that also has to be taken into context. Some patients, when we talk to patients about it, we say, okay, look, the average annualized relapse rate is 1 relapse every 3 years. If you are at year 2 or 2.5 or 3, and you have not had a relapse and you're feeling fine, are you going to keep taking this medication? And that's the real question. A lot of people they're like Lauren, and they know themselves and they say, yes, I will, because I don't want to take the risk of one of these highly effective therapies. And other patients are like, you know what? I'm not. I'm terrible, at sticking with these types of regimens. If I'm feeling fine, there's a good chance I would stop. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's put that voting question back up. All right, so we're talking about ublituximab's net health benefit versus dimethyl fumarate on this outcome, and whether it has a major negative effect to a major positive effect. Go ahead and vote. All right. Okay, we've got 3 no difference, 3 minor, and 4 major. All right, thank you. Let's go to the next one. Same framing, but now we're talking about the caregivers, about the relative advantages, if you will, of ublituximab versus dimethyl fumarate on caregivers' quality of life or their ability to achieve major life goals. So we ask this about every question. Sometimes people think this is mainly about pediatric conditions, but not always. So let's just go off the voting screen here and have a chance to talk briefly about this. So again, it's tricky because we're asking the voting panel to think of ublituximab versus something else on caregiver effect. But let's start with caregiver impact of this condition and whether a new effective treatment could have a major effect on caregivers. Again, patient representatives, would you like to talk about the effects on caregivers, family members, other caregivers?
I mean, we talked about some of the physical impacts on caregivers earlier. There's also the impact of if the person with MS is forced prematurely out of the workforce, what that means for other people in the household, what it means caring for family members or running a household or shuttling children around, just being a parent on a daily basis, knowing that fatigue is one of the primary symptoms that people with MS can have. And then, of course, the cognitive challenges that I've mentioned previously can also have a significant impact on the caregiver to pick up some of that emotional burden of running a household as well, making all the doctor's appointments, following up on kids' homework, the frustration that happens with some of the cognitive challenges that people can face.
Great. Lauren, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'd like to have kind of the undue financial burden for healthcare on caregivers. I mean, I know it was a worry of my parents when I was diagnosed because I was still on their health insurance. What happens if my treatment isn't effective and I turn 26 and I can't get health insurance, I can't get work, something happens with marketplace insurance, et cetera. And I know that was definitely a conversation that wasn't something I expected to have at 18 years old. And it's something that my husband and I talk about. What if, something happens and we need to figure this out? What is our life going to look like?
All right, thanks. Those are helpful perspectives. All right, let's put the voting question back up. And again, the challenge of voting in relation to ublituximab versus dimethyl fumarate, that relative advantage, how does it affect caregivers' quality of life, et cetera here, from A, major negative effect, to E, major positive effect. Okay. All right. 3, no difference, 6, minor positive, and 1, major positive. All right, one last of these types of voting questions, and it's related to society's goal of reducing health inequities. So again, the challenge being, you have to think of, in a sense, multiple sclerosis as a condition and its relative prevalence, if you will, or impact on different communities, and whether ublituximab versus dimethyl fumarate, in our thinking, suggests that it could have anything from a major negative effect to a major positive effect to help society reach its goal of reducing health inequities. So let's take down the voting question again. And first, just from an epidemiologic basis, this is in the report, but is there any reason to believe that the prevalence of MS is more common in certain racial or ethnic subpopulations? Annetta?
Yes. So
yes.
The incidence and prevalence of multiple sclerosis is higher in that 18 to 24-year group in Black and Hispanic females compared to whites. Over a lifetime, it's similar in Blacks as it is compared to whites. It's lower in Hispanics at older age groups and very low and consistently low across all epidemiological studies in Asians. Although, again, that's sort of that's a very broad label for a very broad group of patients. I'm just going to, reiterate these. Every time we get a new drug to market, all the drugs go up in price. And that is a disaster for our MS patients. That the patients, as you always point out, Steve, it prices people out of the marketplace. Those patients are more likely to be Black or Hispanic patients or otherwise indigent, non-college educated white people. And even those that are able to hang on to their insurance, their co-insurances go up. So although it's great to have sort of yet another choice, and there is a celebration around it, for those of us who are really worried about our patients who have unstable insurance and high co-insurances, it's also a very sad day.
And we're definitely going to come back to some of these themes in the policy roundtable as we talk about its introduction into practice. Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, let's go ahead and vote on this one. Ublituximab versus dimethyl fumarate. Does it provide everything from a major negative to a major positive effect on our ability to reduce health inequities? All right. Okay, 3 minor negative, 6 no difference, and 1 minor positive. Okay, having walked through the questions on comparative clinical effectiveness and some of these contextual and potential other benefits issues, we're now going to take a final vote on the long-term value for money. It's a long-winded preamble, so let me just read it and then we'll get into the evidence and the other issues. So back to, given the available evidence for this patient population on comparative effectiveness and incremental cost effectiveness, which I'll ask Mel to summarize again briefly, and considering these other benefits, disadvantages, and contextual considerations, the vote will be, what is the long-term value for money of treatment at current pricing with ublituximab versus dimethyl fumarate? So a lot there. While you're kind of taking that in, Mel, do you mind, again, the incremental cost effectiveness, if you can summarize that information and help them bring that front again as they think about this vote?
Yes, thanks, Steve. The incremental cost per quality adjusted life year gained for ublituximab was $451,000 per quality adjusted life year gained. and $403,000 per equal value life year gained when compared to dimethyl fumarate. So this is nearly 3 times higher than common thresholds for value. Remember, this is still assuming a 23% discount from WAC, which is certainly still an optimistic assumption. The tornado diagram for ublituximab shows that the hazard ratio of progression was a driver of the results. When interpreting the one-way, remember that it uses the most extreme outcomes and only looks at one outcome at a time. So I encourage you to all look at the tornado for key drivers, but refer to the probabilistic sensitivity analysis findings for a better analysis to comprehensively measure uncertainty and the probability of being cost effective. So the PSA for ublituximab showed that none of the 5,000 iterations were less than 100,000 per equal value life year gained, and only 12% were less than an upper threshold for value of 150,000 for equal value life year gained. Remember, these still include that assumed 23% WAC to net discount. The overwhelming majority of the iterations were above commonly cited thresholds. We conducted numerous scenario analyses. Some demonstrated a slightly more cost-effective finding, but only by 3 to 7%. So all still far exceeded common thresholds for value. Given this, we concluded that the cost effectiveness of ublituximab far exceeded common thresholds and would need a discount of 41 to 72% to be near cost effectiveness thresholds.
Okay, and we can take down the voting slide for a sec. Okay, this is your chance to wrestle with cost effectiveness and these other elements integrated in when we're thinking about long-term value for money at the current price, as assumed, as you've heard. Any questions, or as people start to think about how they're going to vote, this is a good time to talk a little bit about how you're thinking of putting these different pieces of the puzzle together and how it might influence your vote, so that we can share that kind of thinking with other CEPAC members. Any questions or that kind of comment before I start calling on people? Steve, you asked a question earlier about, the sensitivity analysis and whether it incorporated a scenario, if you will, or something that could make it seem reasonable for it to be close to traditional cost effectiveness thresholds. Now that you've heard Mel kind of reframe that or represent it, do you mind just talking out loud about how you're starting to think this through?
Yeah, it's coming down to the wire here. So if I remember correctly, it was about 25% of the model iterations were within the, decent value for money range, and about 75% weren't. So I guess I have to go with the 75% saying, low long-term value for money at current price. But I think the probabilistic sensitivity analysis, is compelling, and that was where my first, where I was thinking first. But thinking about the deterministic sensitivity analysis and the particularly the hazard ratio, hearing the experts say that, with these more highly effective monoclonal antibodies that patients seldom have relapses, makes me think maybe the hazard ratio does tend to be closer to that lower credible value of the confidence interval. So if that's the case, I think it was 162 per quality. So I don't know. I'm still back and forth on it, I guess.
If I could just add 2 little pieces of evidence to help that, because that most favorable extreme estimate from that one way is a hazard ratio of progression of 0.2. So very, very extreme, which is typically not standard of care to use the most extreme in thinking about these conversations. And then the percent iterations, so the 26%, that was based on the 200,000, which is above our upper threshold of around 150,000. It was only 12% less than 150,000. And again, just remember that discount, that 23% WAC to net discount is still in there too. So there's a lot of pieces that have to be considered.
Thank you though, Steve. Thank you for expressing your thinking. Aaron, go ahead.
One point that continues to be in my mind in this regard is we're thinking about value for money with respect to this one drug-to-drug comparison, but I still have I guess a part question is how much to also be considering the scenario analyses specifically around which other drugs this may be displacing, especially if those are drugs with comparable effectiveness, but are more cost effective, and how that should play into our overall assessment of the value.
That is a good question. Are you thinking specifically about rituximab? Yeah, I thought you might be.
And that's biosimilars.
I know you guys talked a lot about how to frame the comparison for thinking about value, and it does tie back to the clinical effectiveness information in a way, but do you want to comment on that question? Mel?
Sorry, I'm having trouble unmuting. Can you repeat the question?
Well, it's kind of, I can try to summarize it. It's kind of, we're giving these comparative ICERs versus dimethyl fumarate. And he was trying to think in the real world, how do we think about it versus things like rituximab, which are in the same class, if you will, albeit with biosimilars coming lower. So he's trying to think about the real world and whether a vote on value here should be in some way take into consideration these other comparisons, not just dimethyl fumarate.
Yeah, so that's why I'm having trouble, is the question is versus dimethyl fumarate.
Right, but it's a context. It's almost like another contextual consideration, and we do face these situations where there are other drugs on the horizon, or there are other kind of issues at heart. But it looks like some other people might want to comment. So let me go through there and see what other folks say. Barry, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I mean, Annetta has done a great job gathering a lot of evidence on Rituxan, but we do have to remember that it is not FDA approved for MS. And so while there are certain health systems that use it, it's not really going to get widespread across the entire country coverage by every insurer because of its FDA status. And so if we're considering Rituxan and biosimilars, I think we also have to keep that in mind.
Okay. Annetta, you probably didn't have your hand up. If you didn't have your hand up before, you probably would have put it up now.
I actually did, because I think you do want to take the narrow or broad perspective here. So I think my hope at the end of this meeting is that insurance carriers, after seeing the additional phase 3 data from Anders Svenningson's group in Sweden, where comparing rituximab directly to dimethyl fumarate, that they will stop denying coverage for rituximab biosimilars. There are a lot of patients who can only afford the coinsurance for that or for dimethyl fumarate, and that pharmacy benefits managers will pass those savings along to the patient and to the insurance carrier, and not continue to sort of ratchet up the prices and artificially inflate the price of Rituxan. And when we had only one biosimilar, so that, if you're looking at Ocrevus or ublituximab versus rituximab, and one is $50,000 a year and one is $45,000 a year, and one is FDA approved and one is not, it'll push you to that. But the reality now is we're talking about $2,200 for 500 milligrams a year, which again, 95% of our patients are controlled on. The narrow question, and that's, I think there is a scenario analysis in there that it, beats any every single, even your 50,000 quality, it comes in way below that, right? So it's a highly cost-effective drug. The narrower question of, you're just going to say dimethyl fumarate versus ublituximab, what I would add to that is I noticed that the list price used for dimethyl fumarate may have been before we had multiple generic manufacturers, because the actual price now can be as low as $330 a year. Again, if that's passed on to the patient. I believe there was like even a write-up about that in the New York Times. Some patients, when they switched insurance, they got that $330 price, but when they were on their other insurance, they were still being charged a high rate. And again, that has to do with pharmacy benefits managers, whether they decide to pass that on to the patient or the insurance. So I think in that context, you have this incredibly affordable drug on an annual basis versus this very expensive drug that is more effective. But, I think that has to also sort of be taken into consideration. We now have multiple manufacturers for rituximab biosimilars, which has really driven down the price. And at this point, I don't have any more patients that cannot afford their coinsurance with the rituximab biosimilars. When we only had one, we still had patients who couldn't afford the coinsurance. So,
all right, we
I
will
might
come
just
back
round
to
out
this.
that with the prices that we
Right.
use in our analysis to just, if you're keeping our numbers in mind, these are the prices we use, because there are some stark differences between ublituximab, which was a net price of around $45,000 per year, wholesale acquisition $59,000 per year. Dimethyl fumarate was around $2,700 per year, so big difference. Rituximab biosimilar price that we had used in the comparator was $4,000 per year, so dramatic differences in annual prices.
So Aaron, that was a very comprehensive non-answer to your question, I think. So the voting question, it does ask you to frame it versus dimethyl fumarate. I can't tell you not to take into some context the other drugs that are out there, what's coming, what could be used. And we will talk a lot about that in the policy roundtable. And I probably should just leave it at that, because I don't honestly want to tell you exactly how you should factor that in. But the reason that the question was framed the way it was for many of the reasons that Barry cited, which was as kind of a universal comparator across the country, across different insurers in the current kind of landscape. Dimethyl fumarate made more sense than rituximab in that way. All right, so we've got this voting question. Don't forget, as I will just briefly remind you, that your job is to think about the cost effectiveness, which usually is framed as a range. You know it has uncertainties built into it. No matter what we say, a range is from 50 to 100, 100 to 50, whatever. And you're also asked to factor in these contextual issues that we voted on and the others around the potential other benefits. So if you can do that now, and we'll give you a couple minutes, whatever it takes, please go ahead and vote on the long-term value for money at the current price. Oh, we already got there, okay. Got 9 low long-term value for money at current price and 1 intermediate long-term value for money at current price. All right. That was a great discussion, everybody. Now we get to take a break and then come back to talk about more about the real world of patients, access, the real world that they're experiencing. Barry will be talking about what's happened over the past 6 years since we first had a meeting on multiple sclerosis. So we'll come back and talk about a lot of the bread and butter issues that matter a lot to patients when we come back at 2 o'clock with our policy roundtable. So CEPAC, please come back again at a couple of minutes before then, just so we know everybody's here, but we'll start the webinar again at 2 p.m. Eastern. See you then.